as my friends, brothers and sisters for today's webinar. I would like to thank Nepal Research and Education Network, NREN, for their technical support for today's webinar. I would especially like to thank and welcome Dr. Mary Hubert for accepting our request for having today's webinar. Dr. Mary Hubert, as a geologist, currently serves as a professor for earth sciences at Montana State University. She received her PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1988. Our academic research has focused on mountain belt formation around the world. Starting with dissertation research in the Himalayas of Nepal, she continued to pursue questions in tectonics and structural geology in the Pakistan Himalayas, the Western Alps of Europe, the Southern Alps of New Zealand, the Mauritanians of Senegal, and the Appalachians and Rocky Mountains of North America, among other places. She started her faculty career at the University of Maine, following a NATO postdoctoral fellowship at the ETH in Zurich, Switzerland. Dr. Hubert moves to Kansas State University in 1996, where she served as a professor and then department head. An opportunity to serve as a dean of the College of Science brought Dr. Hubert to Utah State University in 2007. With a passion for internationalization in higher education, she served at the Utah State as the vice provost for global engagement from 2009 to 2013, before returning to her role as professor. In 2015, she moved to MSU, where she served as department head for 3 years before returning to the faculty. In 2017, she was a Fulbright specialist at the Trichandra Multiple Campus. She currently holds a Fulbright Scholar Fellowship to return to Trichandra campus in 2022. Now I would like to request Dr. Hubert to start a presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for that nice introduction. Can you just please confirm that you can see the slide presentation?
Yeah, we are seeing it.
Okay, thank you very much. So today what I want to talk about is lateral heterogeneity in the Himalaya, in the Himalayan mountain belt, meaning that as we move along the range from east to west, what changes do we see? And in particular, I'm going to focus on boundaries between these changes, which I will refer to either as cross faults or cross structures. So those are the things that I will consider as we talk about lateral heterogeneity. Okay, hang on, I'm going to find my cursor here, maybe. Oops, nope. How do I undo that? Oh dear. Oh, laser pointer. Okay, can you see the laser pointer I'm using here? Little red thing. Hopefully you can see that. So before I start, I do want to give credit to a number of people who've worked on this project with me. And first I'll start with Professor Gajarel. So most of you are familiar with Professor Gajarel. All the field work that I've done related to the cross structures has been together with him, as well as discussions that we've had about other cross structures along the range. In the last several years, I've had 2 graduate students working with me. Neil Seifert did some mapping in the Khumbu area, and we'll be looking at his work. Vivek Giri is my current PhD student who will be working on the same structure once we can get back into the field. I've worked as well with Malay Mukul and Vinny Srivastava, both from India, and I'll be presenting some of their work that's related to what we found in Nepal. And finally, Abhi Ghosh is a professor, assistant professor, associate professor, I think, at University of California in Riverside, and he's a seismologist. And so he's also worked, and we'll look at some of his work that relates to this topic. So I'm going to just start with this image. This is not a great Google Earth image, but just for reference, so we're talking about the Himalaya here, the mountain belt that separates the Indian Craton from the Eurasian continent. And primarily what we're looking at here is the Tibetan Plateau region of the political area of China today. And I'm going to be focused mostly on the Himalaya, but I show this image and talk about the adjacent areas because there may be some importance to some of these lateral heterogeneities. So a really quick review. I'm not going to go into all of the geology of the general geology of the Himalaya, but just to remind us what we know. If we start looking at this map in the center, the small map of the whole range, we do know that the range consists of a number of fairly laterally continuous blocks of similar, I'll say, lithology and tectonic characteristics. And these blocks are separated by the major thrust faults. And I find it easier to envision that, to look at it in this block diagram on the right-hand side. The color schemes changed, but the faults are shown here: the main frontal thrust, the main boundary thrust, the main central thrust, and then the extensional structure, the South Tibetan detachment at the very crest of the Himalayan range that separates the Himalaya itself from the sedimentary units of the Tibetan plateau. So that's generally what we see. And of course, we know that the formation of this great mountain belt was from the collision of the Indian continent with the Eurasian continent. And timing of this, various numbers, 58 million years, there is a range. And of course, the timing may not have been synchronous all the way across the range. So we start with that background. And of course, this map just shows all lateral continuity. And this map is based on the early maps by Ganser. So very preliminary mapping, but incredibly accurate, I will say, in that what he found has really held up today in terms of what we see. I will say then, though, that as we move into the topic of this talk, that as we map in more detail, that's when we can find some of the more, see more of the changes in the geology and in the structure moving along the range. So that's what I want to focus on today. I moved to this map, which is a little bit complicated at first glance, but let me explain why I show this map. Again, in the bright colors is the Himalayan mountain belt itself. And again, we've illustrated the sub-Himalaya, the lesser Himalaya, the greater Himalaya moving up through. Then the boundary here with the pink is the South Tibetan detachment system moving into the sedimentary units of Tibet. So that's our Himalaya. But the other things that are shown on here are some of the structures that exist to the south and the north. And I'm going to start with this, and this is, I'll come back to this at the end. So this is a little bit my punchline or what I want to come back to. But I think it's important to note that on the Indian Craton, within the subsurface, there are ridges of crystalline basement rocks, and they are shown in the gray color here, the Delhi Hardwar Ridge, the Faizabad Ridge, and the Mungar Saharsa Ridge in here. And these ridges are trending roughly orthogonal or perpendicular to the range. And in many cases, they are bound by faults themselves, probably extensional structures that seem to have downdropped the blocks in between. So this is going to be important as we talk about structures in the Himalaya itself. Moving north of the range, when we look at Tibet, Tibet's characterized by these north-south grabens. Now there are east-west structures as well, of course, that are compressional convergent structures, but we have the north-south, roughly north-south rift structures that are so prominent across Tibet. And I just want to point those out before we move on. Just another closer look at the rift structure. So here's the outline of the political boundaries of Nepal. So the Himalaya itself down here in the southern part, but to the north, these red faults are the normal faults of the prominent rift structures. I show this map as well. This is from a paper in the 1980s of Dasgupta. And he was trying to show several different things here. He's got some earthquake fault plane solutions here that are all strike slip fault plane solutions. And then all the lines that go across this, and I apologize, this figure's not clear. It's not, didn't reproduce well in the publication. But these are traces of lineaments that were identified on some of the early satellite images. So people proposed these as faults. They've not been mapped in the field. They're, again, just lineaments from imagery, and you see them crisscrossing the range. So if you only looked at this image, you would think that the Himalaya was characterized only by north-south type structures. You can see through here to some of the thrusts that are put here on the map as well. But I just want to show that there was recognition of things that cut across the range early on. Okay, another map from the literature. This is Godin and Harris, 2014, and I show this because it nicely shows where these ridge structures are. So the map I showed earlier is based on this map. But it shows the topography. In the blue colors is overlain the superficial geology, and you can see the traces of the big river systems that move across those ridges. And so know that the ridges are buried by all the foreland sediment. So we've got thicker bits of sediment in these blue areas, thinner sedimentary cover on the ridge tops. But again, it just gives you a sense of these structures to the south. Okay, I want to now come back to the Himalaya itself and talk about how I got involved in looking at cross structures. And some of you are aware that I did my PhD work in the 1980s, 85, 86, and 87 were my field seasons in eastern Nepal in the Everest region. And the focus of my PhD at that time was largely to look at the inverted metamorphism along the main central thrust, which is the contact between the two blue colors in this map. And this is kind of the region, the study area that I had for that project. Following the 1980s, I moved on and worked on other mountain belts around the world. I taught at several universities. I had some administrative positions. I raised 2 kids. And so I wasn't back in Nepal until 2016, when I went back to revisit some of the unanswered questions from my dissertation work. Now, so here's a close-up of that region that was in the red box on the previous slide. So this is the Dudh Kosi Valley. This is that region in eastern Nepal. Here's the summit of Everest up here on the right. Sorry, that's my dog. The Dudh Kosi River is here. Lukla would be just about where the cursor is right now, kind of in the center of this image. The bright colored area is the main central thrust zone. These are different lithologies in the MCT. But Google Earth, since the 1980s, Google Earth has become a staple in my diet. So I'm a bit of a Google Earth addict. And when I went back in 2016, I was looking at the location of some of the samples we collected on Google Earth. And I'm going to focus in on the area where this red box is. And this is the Google Earth image from that. And so the Dudh Kosi River is coming down through the middle. Namche would be just off the slide to the top. Lukla would be down to the south, again off the slide. But what I noticed on the Google Earth image was this very linear structure in the topography. So several subparallel lineaments here. I think I have some arrows kind of pointing out where they go, striking northeast, southwest. And these were curious to me. And of course, I'd walked up and down this valley many times, crossed this, but without the help of that bird's eye view from Google Earth, I hadn't noticed these structures. And so my question, of course, was, is this a fault, or is this some kind of a landslide feature that's, you know, some sort of anomalous thing? And so I was curious about this. And I noticed this in the fall, it was the fall of 2017, just before I came back to Nepal on that first Fulbright fellowship. Just before going back to Nepal, I attended the GSA meeting, and well, let me get to that in just a second. We'll back up here and zoom away from that. That last image was right in this region here. So that airplane sitting on Namche, the other airplane sitting on Lukla, and we were looking at this region near the village of BENKAR. And we are ultimately going to refer to this structure as the BENKAR fault. But let me point out a few more things on this structure. So if we zoom out in Google Earth and take a look, there's a bit of a linear feature that runs right up through the peak of Tabuche and actually strikes right on into the Khumbu Glacier Valley. So this is the lower Khumbu Glacier, which eventually turns and goes up to the summit of Everest in here, but quite linear. Looking down to the south, there's also a trace or a suggestion of something cutting across the range here, disrupting some of the other topographic patterns. And so again, my question at that time was, is this a fault? At that time, I began to dig into the literature. And this is a map over here on the right-hand side from Roto Kurosi. Some of you know Roto. He's been in Nepal a number of times, and I know met with many of you students. But this is a map he had from an early paper in the 1990s. And while he maps a structure in here that goes up almost through Tabache, he shows it as a west dipping structure. I'll say that what we eventually found was a southeast dipping structure, and notice that all his strike and dip symbols in here show a southeast dipping fabric in this whole zone right across here. And so at this point, I began to believe there might be something to this BENKAR structure. Like I said, I attended the GSA meeting in the fall of 2017 before going back to Nepal. And the man that presented before me was an Indian geologist named Malay Mukul. And he gave a talk about a couple cross faults that I'm going to talk about in a minute. At the time, I didn't have the confidence to go and speak with him. I hadn't read his papers, and I was curious about his work. So I went back to the library and looked things up, and later got up the courage to send him an email. He wrote right back to me, and since then we have been discussing cross structures. So we'll talk about that in his work a little bit more. So here's the trace of the BENKAR fault that I would propose without even visiting the field, based solely on the Google Earth image. Again, that square there is the original image where I saw those topographic features. So zooming back out to the range as a whole, the structure we've just been talking about here is BENKAR, and we will come back to this. I'll talk a little bit more about it. But the structures that Malay Mukul had discussed at that 2017 GSA meeting were the Gish fault and the Kosi fault in here. And so when I went back to the literature following his presentation, I found the papers where he discusses his work on the Gish structure. When he wrote to me, he said that he was about to publish on the Kosi, which he then did in 2018, and ultimately sent me that paper as well. This is a little more speculative structure that comes up through here. But a lot of his work is based on cross structures that coincide with what he calls the salients and recesses of the Himalaya. And so if we look at the range front along the Himalaya, and this image is a good one to do that, we see a number of things. One, there are these recesses where the range front dips more landward or towards the range, and the salients where the range protrudes outwards more onto the Indian Craton. Of course, we also have the dune valleys in some cases associated with the salients and recesses. But what he found was that these structures were bounding those faults. He had also worked on two structures in the western part of the Himalaya, in the Indian Himalaya, and this is the Yamuna tear fault and the Ganga tear fault, and we'll take a closer look at these in a minute. I will just mention a few other cross structures, recent literature on the Western Nepal fault system that comes across kind of from Gurla Mandata across the range. And I consider this, while it is a bit of a cross structure or cross fault, it's at a lower angle to the range as a whole, and it's somewhat on strike with the Karakoram fault. And I think there's a relationship there in the transport. And then I've put the Takala Graben up here, but it is really one of the rift structures like we see across Tibet, though it does work its way into the Himalaya itself. Okay, so if we go to the west and take a look at the Yamuna and Ganga tear faults, what we found, and this is work based on Srivastava 2018, as well as earlier work by Sahu. Sahu was looking at some of the early satellite imagery, but what they found were offsets in the range front. So this YTF here, this is the Yamuna tear fault, and you can see fairly clearly that it offsets the range front in a sinistral sense. On the Ganga tear fault, it's over here on the east of this map, and it offsets in a, sinistral. This actually offsets in a dextral sense, so we're not seeing the continuation here. But these were two structures that cut the foreland. And so the amounts of offset for the Yamuna, about 20 kilometers, the Ganga, 11 kilometers. Now these numbers are somewhat small compared to displacements we know on something like the main central thrust, that's probably over 100 kilometers. But nevertheless, they play a role in shaping the topography that we see today, and of course the geology. But the other important thing is that they cut the main frontal thrust, and the main frontal thrust has been active in the last 15,000 years. And so by cutting that, that means these structures are probably active, or certainly have been active in very recent times. So let's go back. Oh, so there are the structures themselves shown here in the purple. Okay, just returning to this map, we're going to move to the east and look at these other structures. I didn't mention the Kathmandu Valley. There are some recognized cross structures on either side of the Kathmandu Valley, and these are going to warrant more detailed work, I think, but there's been a little bit of work done on those. So if we go to further to the east to the Gish and Kosi, these are, this is a figure from the Mukul et al. Paper where he shows the Gish structure coming out here, separating the Dharan salient from the Gorobatan recess in here. So this yellow line is somewhat tracing the range front itself with the salients and recesses. An important thing, so the Gish fault is sinistral, but an important thing to note about it as well is just the coincidence of its location with respect to the Mungar Saharsa Ridge and the Kishanganj fault in here. So there's somewhat of an alignment. What's not shown clearly on this is that there's another structure up here going into Tibet, so bordering the Himalaya and Tibet, that's the Yadang rift structure up in this area, or the Yadang fault, and they all seem to align. If we look at the Kosi, again, it's much more speculative, so note the dashed lines and the double question marks here, but there is some evidence down in the Kosi River Valley, down in the range front, for an offset in a sinistral sense as well on the Kosi fault. So these two structures will warrant more work in the future. But the mapping by the Mukul group in the vicinity of this Gish structure, they have also noticed changes in structural behavior, I'd say, across the fault. So changes in duplex geometry, some changes in the rock units exposed, the metamorphism, and so on across that structure. Okay, I'll come back now to the BENKAR structure. So as I mentioned, I identified this just based on Google Earth. I then did some research and found that others, including Rodo Karosi, had noticed some kind of a structure going through this area. I'd finally had conversations with Malai Mukul about other cross structures. So it seemed like in 2017 that it was time to go investigate whether the BENKAR structure is indeed a cross fault. And if so, what are the kinematics? What's the timing of movement? What are the other details? So this is about the time that my grad student, Neil Seifert, he began his master's thesis. And this area outlined in yellow is approximately where he was mapping the BENKAR structure. So we'll look at some of the results from that work. So the map on the left is his field map and his data. And there are small strike and dip symbols I don't expect you to see in this map, but if we look at the purpley color strike and dip symbols, to the east, generally things have a more east-west strike. This is the metamorphic fabric of these gneisses of the greater Himalayan sequence, and they're dipping to the northeast, and the same to the west. East-west strike, northerly dip, but within this zone outlined by these two purple lines, we find dominantly a more northeast strike of the metamorphic fabric and a southeast dip. So that was kind of what he found in map pattern. Again, this does go through the peak of Tabuche. I'll point that out again. It's right here. The village of BENKAR is down to this in the southern area in here. And then this light blue glacier here is the Khumbu Glacier going up the Khumbu Valley, which then turns into the Khumbu Icefall, and the summit of Everest is off here to the right. So this just gives you a sense of kind of what we found on the BENKAR. We don't know where it goes to the south. This will be the job of Bibek Giri to trace this further to the south once we can get back in the field. So notice the northerly bound of the main central thrust zone in here, and we don't know if that structure cuts the fault. So just summarizing what I've just said, the northeast strike of this zone, the sense of shear, what we found is that it's a normal dextral shear. So locally we have a more normal shear, but overall we've got a dextral sense of shear on this zone. Neil did some preliminary argon-argon dating with a few samples from to the west within the zone and to the east, and found that the deformation or the offset based on those ages has to be less than 12 million years in a normal sense. Again, that doesn't tell us when it started, but at least some of this deformation was younger than 12 million years. Looking at some examples from the field, there's a very dominant, so looking at the upper right photograph here at a shear surface, there's a dominant stretching lineation or mineral lineation that's plunging to the southeast. And if we look in sort of cross section at these shear zones, so now we're looking to the northwest at this zone, but you see the east side down with respect. So you can see kind of drag of the metamorphic fabric into this shear zone. And so these are the types of things that we looked at, coupled with thin sections to get this normal and dextral sense of shear. One of the interesting things about the deformation, it's not completely penetrative throughout that whole zone that was outlined by the pink lines. So there are zones of higher strain within that. And within a sample, just a hand sample, we also see the deformation partitioned into zones of concentrated sillimanite. So this is fine-grained fibrous sillimanite in here. And most of the displacement we think has been taken up along those sillimanite planes. And from these thin sections, we also interpret a right lateral sense of shear. Okay, so again, just summarizing the kind of outcomes on the BENKAR. Let me just back up for a second. The next two images are, the first one will be taken in BENKAR or just above the village of BENKAR, looking at that topographic feature. And we're going to look right up that topographic feature. We're going to be looking to the northeast, and we're going to see Tabuche in the far distance. And the photo following that will be a photograph of the south face of Tabuche as well. And we'll see some interesting features there. So this one is just primarily kind of the topographic view of that structure. And you can see a little bit of the fabric in here, perhaps, that's dipping to the southeast. So we're looking to the northeast. We call this the BENKAR notch. And this was our kind of first view of this fault zone. Difficult at this point when we very first saw this to know for sure that it was a fault until we began to look at these rocks up close. So we're looking through this BENKAR notch. We think that one of the strands of this zone goes right through here. The peak up here with the snow on it is the peak of Tabuche and Cholatse and the ridge between them. And the next photo will be a close-up of this zone, which is right here. And on this image, it really just kind of looks like a snow patch, but it's much more interesting up close. So when we look up close at that, so this is just a photo taken with a long lens from just across the valley, a little bit closer to Tabuche. What we see is a nice shear zone here that's southeast dipping, basically cuts to the edge of one of these leucogranite intrusions. So this is a larger leucogranitic body, but throughout this face of Tabuche, there are many leucogranitic dikes and sills that cut across here. The sense of shear, again, what we see is the fabric coming up here, and it's being dragged into this shear zone in a sense consistent with a normal sense of movement, or at least some component of normal movement, probably coupled with the dextral deformation. So I think it's important at this point to just ask ourselves, yeah, why are these cross structures important? And I think that brings us really to the seismicity. And this is an image, these are two images from work of Abi Ghosh in 2019. They have a paper on the data, on the aftershock or seismic data from the 2015 earthquake. And this map on the left is a little hard to get a spatial orientation, but Kathmandu is about where my cursor is now. If you can see it moving around, this is a map view of aftershock data. And what is important in this is to look at this scattering of data that comes across to the east, and then boom, it ends very abruptly along a trend that's northeast southwest oriented. Very few aftershocks to the east of that linear zone, I'll say. This image on the lower right is the cross section that's longitudinal that comes across here running east-west. So looking to the north, so east or southeast is on the right-hand side of this. Again, if we look at that zone on the eastern side, the termination of the aftershock data, we see a fairly linear truncation there. And this would be the trace of some kind of planar feature that would propagate up to the surface at about this location, which is coincident with something called the Gauri-Shankar lineament, which we'll look at in map view in just a minute. Also notice that these aftershocks are occurring about 10 to 20 kilometers in depth. So if we look at this other map, this is a map from the paper that we recently published that's a review of this lateral heterogeneity. Here we show the same aftershock data on a map, traces of some of the major thrust faults in the background in the blue color. Our BENKAR fault is off to the east, but here's the Gauri-Shankar lineament and map view. And keep in mind that the aftershocks are at depth. So these reds are primarily 10 to 20 kilometers at depth, and they project up to the surface in a zone that's parallel to this and coincident with this Gauri-Shankar lineament. When we look at all this data, what we've proposed, and this kind of came out of discussions at the last HKT, Himalaya Karakoram Tibet conference that was here in Bozeman, and what we would propose is that these cross structures may play a role in limiting the lateral propagation of earthquake rupture on the major thrusts. Remember that this area of earthquake rupture scales with the magnitude of the earthquake. And so So the larger the area that ruptures, the larger the magnitude of the earthquake. If these structures are limiting that rupture area, then they are also helping to minimize or limit the size of the earthquake events. If this is true, this is an important feature, and it'll be important to know where these cross structures are and how they relate. And so do we see this anywhere else in the world? I'm taking you now quickly just to South America, and we're looking at the west coast of South America and the Peru-Chile Trench. So I don't have a reference map here, but we're right where that coastline makes a bend. And in 2001, there was a large earthquake, an 8.4. The propagation of that rupture, so it was on a thrust structure. Here's the fault plane solution for that major structure, but it propagated laterally, but it hit a structure, again, that was perpendicular to the trace of the thrust fault. It stopped rupturing for 30 seconds before it finally penetrated that surface, but with reduced energy as it went on beyond. And these workers, this is Robinson et al. In 2006, they proposed that cross structure was playing a role in limiting the rupture of that thrust structure within this subduction zone area. They attributed that planar feature, that cross structure, to some kind of an influence from the Nazca fracture zone. Now remember, the Nazca fracture zone is in the downgoing or subducting plate, whereas the thrust rupture was in the overriding plate of the subduction zone. So they're proposing that there can be an influence from a downgoing slab on the overlying rocks or the hanging wall to that kind of a structure. So we could potentially take that back to the Himalaya and suggest that maybe structures on the downgoing Indian continent have caused some influence on structures above. A little bit more on the seismicity in this map. So we're looking at the very easternmost bit of Nepal and the Sikkim area before getting into Bhutan. 2001, there was a 6.9 earthquake in Sikkim. This was originally proposed to be on strike with the Dubri-Chungdang Fault, which extends across the Ganges Plain down towards the Shillong Plateau. This is the fault plane solution. The other possible fault plane, of course, is aligned in a northeast-southwest trend, possibly more subparallel to the Kosi or Gish structures in this area. But the other interesting thing about this earthquake event is that it was more than 50 kilometers at depth, which means that it's deeper than the main Himalayan thrust. The 2015 Nepal earthquake, we think was on the main Himalayan thrust, was a rupture on that thrust plane. This would be an earthquake deeper than that thrust plane, which again suggests some activity in the subducting Indian plate. Further evidence for that is in, again, we're looking at just some microseismicity from eastern Nepal. So this is the boundary of eastern Nepal here. Here's our proposed Kosi fault, the BENKAR fault, several other cross structures that are identified. But from this map, it's interesting that some of the seismicity aligns, again, along sort of northeast-southwest trends. And again, the depths of some of these earthquakes are greater than 50 kilometers, again suggesting that some of the actual fault displacement on these structures is in the downgoing Indian slab. So the paper that we recently put out, we reviewed lots of other evidence for lateral variation in the geology along the Himalaya and found that there's plenty. People have reported sedimentary thickness variations in the foreland, but also probably in the lesser Himalayan units. There are changes laterally in metamorphic grade. There are changes in uplift rates. So we're getting more and more sort of quantitative analysis of cooling histories and uplift histories of different regions. And we see changes laterally along the range. If you look at a map of the leucogranites, the roughly 20 million year intrusives, we see they occur in some areas and not others. There are many other examples of lateral variation. Of course, some offset in units. There's changes in duplex geometry and other features along strike of the range. So what are these cross structures? What might be causing lateral heterogeneity? And I've tried to hint at this all along the way. There may be a number of factors. If we just look at some figures that BEBEK put together, thinking about the BENKAR fault zone, we have limited mapping on that only in the greater Himalaya, shown in the green color. But there's a possibility if it cuts the main central thrust, but not into the lesser Himalaya, could it be a tear fault just on the thrust structures? That would be an obvious idea, but there is a suggestion that it continues down to the Ganges plain. So is it a tear structure, a tear fault on lower thrusts? Could it be influenced by extension in the Tibetan plateau, propagating down into the Himalaya itself? And of course, I've mentioned the structures within the Indian craton itself. So these ridges have a very similar strike to the faults. They are bound, the ridges are bound by faults, which seem to possibly extend up into the Himalaya. And this has been proposed by a number of workers. I think that what we're missing at this point is detailed mapping of the bounds of some of the lateral changes in the geology, as well as specific mapping along these fault structures. Well, taking a really quick look at other mountain belts, and BEBEK and I are working on a paper right now, just examining, again, a sort of a review, a literature review of where we see these structures, similar type structures around the world. And we've already looked at an example that was from this bend in the Andes mountain chain in here, but we also see evidence for cross structures in the Western North America Cordillera all along this range, in the Appalachians, a much older mountain belt, in the Alps, and in the Zagros. And of course, the Alps and the Zagros are part of this great alpine Himalayan chain that extends across the southern boundary of Eurasia. So with that, let me just summarize and say that I think the Himalaya has a number of cross faults or cross structures that cut across it. These may play a role in bounding some of the lateral heterogeneity that we see in the geologic features. What we know so far, while none of these structures have been mapped all the way from the greater Himalaya to the Ganges plain, we have evidence for some structures down in the sub-Himalaya. We have evidence for structures in the greater Himalaya. So we would propose that at this point, we do see them at all structural levels. And I think most importantly, there may be seismic implications for these cross structures. And as to a cause, I think that's still unclear, but I think it's important that we notice that they do align with structures in the Indian basement, as well as the rift zones in the Tibetan region. And the way forward is going to be, we need to be in the field, we need to map these structures in order to gain a better understanding. And with that, I thank you all for your attention. And I can take questions. I will stop sharing, maybe.
If there are any queries, please write your queries on chat box.
Rajan sir, please make all attendees as panelists.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Okay.
Somebody must have a question.
Yeah, yes. You can.
Kosifal
Yeah.
has done something in formation. Oh, so I'm not familiar with that dune name, but is it right adjacent there to the fault to the west?
Dune means intermountain basin, even Shivalik, Trijuga Valley.
Okay, yeah, possibly. And again, the COSI fault is very speculative at this point. And so we need to get in the field, and we've proposed to do that. And hopefully COVID will subside and we can all get back there. Okay, yes. Is there yeah, probably the COSI fault is responsible for the shifting of the river. And that's part of the kind of speculation of its existence is a lot of evidence where that river takes a big bend. Others?
Yeah, another from Krishna Gotame, you can see in chat.
Okay, how could we relate the trans-Himalayan thrust and the higher Himalayan thrust? So, yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean. Specifically, which area? If you can clarify a little bit on that question. Which fault is older? Okay, yeah, good question. Which fault is older, the COSI fault or the main boundary thrust? Yeah, that's where the mapping comes in. So what we need to do is get out in that area and trace those structures, the cross structures, and to look at the detail of where the, say, the MBT comes in there. The COSI fault may align with the Toppeljung window, which is a big bend in the main central thrust. So there is a change in orientation of the MCT in that area. And I kind of suspect that it may be related to the COSI fault. Okay, so nice presentation. I have two questions. Have you checked the 2015 earthquake's rupture was stopped with some evidence of such cross faults, mainly in eastern edge of rupture areas? Can cross faults on the surface explain anything about the variation of the MHT at depth? Yeah, again, really good question. So yeah, so what we are proposing is that these cross structures may indeed actually cut or penetrate the HT and go down to depth, and that may be why we get some of these deep earthquakes at depths greater than 50 kilometers. And yeah, and so let's see. So the cross faults on the surface may indeed tell us something about what's going on with the MHT. So we kind of need a combination of geophysics, of good seismic data that can give us the view at depth, and then we need better surface mapping to show us where these structures are on the surface. Could you please elaborate a little about the upliftment of the Shillong Plateau and those ridge structures? Yeah, Shillong Plateau is really an interesting feature. I haven't worked on it, so I can't give you too much more on that. And there are a lot of similarities between the uplift of the Shillong and some of our Rocky Mountain uplifts that are basement involved uplifts. That Dubri structure that goes down kind of coincides with the western boundary of the Shillong Plateau. But I think my understanding is there are both thrusts that dip north on the southern boundary of Shillong and dip south on the northern boundary, making it a bit of a pop-up structure. Can we trace the suture zone in eastern Himalaya, I mean along the Indo-Burma range? If I am not wrong, then the Indus suture is truncated north-south. Yeah, I'm not sure about that truncation. I mean, it has to wrap around somehow because there's obviously a suture on that eastern side as well as on the western side. But how that's mapped, I'm not sure. After the 2015 earthquake, the western region of Nepal is more prone of higher magnitude. Is there any possibility of higher earthquake in Western Nepal? Aha, that one's hard to say. And I think that the reason that was proposed in a lot of papers is just that it's a kind of a seismic gap where there hasn't been a big earthquake in the known time period. And therefore, when we haven't had a big earthquake, then an area is possibly prone to a large earthquake. We need to learn more about possible cross structures out in that area as well. Okay, and then yes, people could unmute and ask questions.
Thank you, Professor Mary. It's very nice to see you here, and welcome back again. Your last presentation was also fine, like excellent, and this time also you are sharing the knowledge to the young scholars like we. And at this pandemic time, it's very, very, very much helpful for us to know about the geology of Nepal and the other Himalayan regions. And I would like to personally, I'd like to thanks for sharing those information with us. Thank you, Professor.
Well, thank you all very much. It's really great to see you, and I'm glad that you could come together during this lockdown time. We watch from a distance, sadly, with what's been happening in Nepal. I hope that the lockdown will turn around the COVID cases. I hope that more and more vaccine will come your way. I hope our president of the United States is sending vaccine your way. I think that's maybe happening. But the vaccine is certainly very, very important to the limiting the spread of this. And if we can do that, then we can be back in person. So currently I'm scheduled to be back in Nepal for a number of months, next February through May. So I hope to be able to see you all in person at that time, and we can talk in more detail, and hopefully we can get out in the field and map some of these structures so we can answer some of these questions. But I wish you all good luck in your studies. It's definitely a challenging time. It's a challenging time for everybody, but it's a challenging time to be a student. And so, you know, thank goodness for the internet, where we can stay connected through these kinds of presentations, that you can have access to the literature and spend this time reading up on some of these papers. But thank you for hosting me, for inviting me to come and present. And I'm impressed that there were 80 some people on this presentation.
Okay, there is one more question, ma'am.
Okay, yeah. Okay, there's a couple I see here. Any idea on what magnitude earthquake can limit by such cross structures? Yeah, I mean, that's an unknown in terms of how they might be limiting. And again, until we sort of map these out and know how many cross structures there are and where they are, it would be hard to say. But when you look at a historic map, if you look at the 1932 earthquake, and just based on history and reported damage and so on, you see that it's in a zone, and then it ends, and that the feeling of that earthquake didn't extend beyond that area. So maybe it was some of these cross structures that played a role. What mechanism is leading to the formation of these cross structures? Well, that's a good question too. And I'm guessing that there's a bit to do just with the mechanics and the strength of materials, that it's hard to have a thrust sheet that can stay strong and intact across such a big area. So that I think that there's prone to the thrust sheets are prone to tearing. But I also wonder, it just seems like more than a coincidence that these ridges on the downgoing Indian plate, that they coincide with the cross structures. And I'm guessing that there's a bit of, small movement on the faults adjacent to those ridges. So there's some reactivation as they succumb to the convergence and to the compression between the Indian and Eurasian plates, the ongoing convergence. And so as they shift and move a little bit, so do the overlying cross structures, or some of that movement propagates up through to form these cross structures. Again, that may be hard to ever really prove, but I think what we need is more data to show further spatial coincidence of these structures. Any others? If not, I'll just say thank you very much, and good luck to.
Yeah, you have from the Rajni Shrestha. What would be the mechanism leading to the formation of these cross structures?
Yeah, that's what I was just trying to answer with possibly the mechanism being small movements on the downgoing faults on the Indian craton, on the crystalline Indian basement that's being subducted basically under the Himalaya. And if you have a little bit of movement, that mechanism may propagate upwards and cause these cross structures. But otherwise it may be, if they're just tear faults and they're in the confined to the overlying, just to the hanging walls of thrusts, then they would have to do with the strength of the materials. Yeah.
I
Okay.
think if anyone have questions, you can please ask.
Thank you, Shiva, and good to see good to see you. I can't see you, but we'll post it.
Professor Mary,
Yeah.
yeah, recently, like we have 2015 earthquake and most of the affected area on the central section. So do you think like eastern part or western part, which area is more vulnerable for the upcoming earthquake? Like, I mean, in which area we will probably face the catastrophic earthquake?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's obviously very hard to know. As someone pointed out earlier, there's a bit of a seismic gap to the west, and people have talked about that's an area that's prone. You all may have felt the earthquakes last night, maybe just, wait, so no, it would have been, sorry.
It's around 5:30 a.m. in the Nepalese
Yeah,
time.
it was early morning for you. It was night for me. Yeah, yeah, the 5.3 or so that was closer to Pokhara. So I always think it's a good thing when I have an app on my phone, so my phone lets me know whenever you have an earthquake, and it's always good. I think it's always good when you have these smaller quakes, because the more smaller quakes, the more stress that's being released and the less that's building up for a big one. But the eastern Nepal has also seen some very large quakes historically. Oh,
Every time we get the wake up call from like earthquakes. Now
Yeah.
it's same like the Japan.
yeah. Wow. Well, good luck. I mean, this is not a good time for an earthquake in Nepal. Let's one disaster at a time. Let's get past COVID.
Yeah, but like the smaller one is okay rather than the big ones.
Yeah, we like the small one. Yeah.
Dr. Hubert, there is a question there. What is the possible indication of such a zone of Himalayan syntics from aerial photograph? And there
Oh,
is next question as well.
okay, wait. Oh, what is the possible indication of suture zone of Himalayan syntaxis from aerial photograph? Oh, yeah. I mean, again, that's sort of out of the scope of this presentation or any of my research. I haven't pursued the suture zone. But you know that when the plates collided and India is indented into Eurasia, and so that suture zone has to go around the syntaxis. The syntaxes, both on the east and west, are really concentrated deformations. So there's extreme faulting and folding of rocks. So whether there's any oceanic crustal rocks preserved as suture zone rocks in that area, I mean, I don't know. Again, it's beyond any work that I've done. But there has to be a location of that suture zone wrapping around both those corners. And Google Earth is a good place to go, again, during lockdown. if you can pull it up on your computer, there's so many areas you can explore. So yeah, I encourage doing your preliminary work on Google Earth. Then you need to follow up with field exploration. Yeah, and Shiva, I see, I don't know if that's the link that I saw this morning on Facebook to the data on that earthquake on this from the school seismographs. So that's just a fantastic project. We're hoping to get another 6 seismic stations installed in the 6 schools. I'm working on a Rotary project with the Truperswar Rotary Club, and we hope to get that funded soon. So I think the more seismometers we can get across the state, the better. The country, the better. Okay, I wonder if there are oblique thrust ramps that play role as cross structures. Yeah, actually, I didn't really mention thrust ramps, but yes, thrust ramps probably play a role as cross structures, and you may have a ramp of a thrust at one level and it may propagate up as a cross fault to the surface. So we do need to keep that in mind, so that they may play a big role. Others, any others?
Yeah, there is a question just above that. Is there any relation between cross fault and differential rate of movement of Indian plate?
Ah, okay, yeah. Well, that's, yeah, again, that's our speculation, is not so much differential rates of, northward movement, but more vertical movement, sort of up and down of the Indian plate basement. That I think is really likely to be having an impact on the causing of these cross faults and the movement of these cross faults. And again, some of the evidence for that is the fact we see these strike slip earthquakes with depths, focal depths that are greater than 50 kilometers, so below the main Himalayan thrust. Yeah, good questions. Lots of good questions.
Now, I don't think there are any more queries. So thank you very much, Dr. Hubert.
Okay, yeah, thank you all very much. Namaste and stay safe. Keep your mask on. Yeah, and we'll hope for the best in all of this.
Okay, and at last, I would like to request President of NGSS to say a few words and end this webinar.
Wonderful presentations today in front of us, and we want to thank all of the participants, senior geologists and others, member of this society, and we have shared some idea of Professor Mary research. She have done research from many years. From her PhD, she have already told us. She has made some she has involved the Nepalese as well in her research. That is really good news for us, and we are happy to know about it. And she comes in Nepal and is interacting with many geologists, students, professors, and sharing her ideas in many platforms. And actually, I have also met her in TC Trichandra College and also in 9th Nepal Geological Congress, where I was volunteering, and I think she also remember. And I also knew many things from her presentation at that time as well, and now as well. And we are really happy. We are mostly, as you know, we are mostly limited in field-based investigation and few laboratory works, but we are lacking advanced lab work. But I think these shortcomings will be overcome certainly in coming days. And for now, like Professor Mary, other researchers, geoscientists will help us in upcoming days for the collaboration and for supporting the student like us in our research or thesis. And I want to request if Professor Mary have something to say, then we will end the program.
Okay, thank you very much. I really want to thank you for this opportunity, and I guess I would like to say that my experience in Nepal has been incredibly meaningful in my life in many different ways. And when I completed my PhD work and people would say, oh, how was the geology in Nepal? And I would say, oh, the geology was good, but the best part about Nepal are the people. And that's really the truth. And that's just a gift that you all have. And I hope you appreciate this gift you have and can use it wisely. And I agree with you that I I hope that good labs and good facilities will be coming soon in Nepal, and that any way we can help to bring those there, that will be fantastic. And you, as this group of students, you're the Nepal Geological Student Society, you are the future. And so you've got a great opportunity to help make things different, to make new discovery on the geology, to bring new laboratories. You will have responsibility to teach the next generation. You've got many challenges to work towards in Nepal in terms of developing hydropower, building safe roads, working with engineers to build safe structures, because we do know those earthquakes will come. So anyway, I just say, again, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for the gift that you all have given me through the opportunity to work in Nepal.
Okay, ma'am, thank you. And now, actually it was the time 8 p.m. and it actually today time is not favorable for all of us. And it is like a dinner time, but many students and other geologists have taken their patience and came to listen your presentations, and so that they have learned many things. And actually we did not find the reduction in the number of participants today, and we want to thank all the participants in this program, and we want to now end this program. Thank you all once again.